to speak here. One of the major side effects of the Russian war on Ukraine has been that EU enlargement is back on the top of the EU agenda. For many years in the past, this EU policy has mainly stagnated. So the solid line shows you a measure, let's say, of the average status that European countries have in terms of membership in the European Union. Basically, from the mid-2010s, this has been a flat line. The dashed line shows you, say, the number of enlargement-related events, status changes for European countries. And here you also see that basically after the accession of Bulgaria and Romania in 2007, there has been a downward slope in the enlargement activities of the European Union, and basically in the past years, nothing much has happened. And last year, then, as a reaction to the war, we've seen a flurry of activities and events, starting from from applications for membership from many countries in Eastern Europe, and then also Kosovo in the Western Balkans. Accession negotiations with North Macedonia and Albania have finally started. The EU has offered candidate status to Ukraine and Moldova, and given Georgia a potential membership status. So a major flurry of activities. But I want to say this has not been just a quantitative shift, but we also see some kind of a qualitative shift in the nature of the EU's enlargement policy. So, I mean, this is of course quite stylized, but I would argue that in the past, in the 1990s, we've seen what one could call transformative enlargement, where the idea was, okay, enlargement is a tool to help modernize, Europeanize non-member states. The main focus, the main purpose was to use enlargement as a means to facilitate, speed up domestic transformation towards liberal democracy, market economies in these non-member states. And the method has been a gradual rapprochement of these countries to the European Union, very conditional, where it was, okay, if you want to move closer, if you want to move the next step, you have to fulfill X and Y conditions related to liberal democracy, to market integration and policy integration. It has been differentiated, where mostly countries were individually assessed according to their own merits in meeting the EU conditions. Now, what we're seeing now, in my analysis, is a shift from this transformative enlargement to a more geopolitical enlargement, where this is in the context of a new systemic rivalry that didn't exist in the 1990s, where the purpose of enlargement shifts from domestic transformation to, say, international demarcation, where this is about, okay, making sure that countries remain in our camp, rather than being controlled by systemic rivals. And so the main goals here shift in the direction of say, the territorial consolidation of the geographical scope of European integration, the stabilization of countries, and the denial of foreign control. And in this regard, the EU then also moves away from this gradual conditional method to one that's more driven, let's say, by high-level political decisions unrelated to democratic conditionality and more in a, let's say, strategic view. So if you look at how liberal democracy has developed in these countries over the past 5 years or so, it becomes quite clear that the 2022 decisions were rather unrelated to major changes in the political regimes of these countries. I listed Croatia on the top. That's the solid line as some kind of a reference benchmark, which is the country that has last joined the European Union. And what you can see, for instance, yes, in the case of Moldova, we have seen this change, but we also know that without the war in Ukraine, the EU would not have offered Moldova a membership perspective in spite of its clear, let's say, positive trajectory towards liberal democracy. The other solid line is Ukraine, and you can see that it has remained, say, rather at the bottom of the pack, if you like. For say, the decision to offer a membership perspective to grant candidate status is rather unrelated to progress towards liberal democracy in Ukraine before the war. This clearly shows, in my view, that we've seen quite of a detachment between enlargement decisions and say, political developments, liberal democratic developments in the region. Now, one could have assumed that the decisions in 2022 were mainly symbolic, mainly as a response of solidarity driven by the war, but it has become more and more clear that the EU is actually serious about enlargement, and this could nowhere be seen better than just a few days ago when President Macron spoke at the GlobeSec meeting in Bratislava. Why am I singling out him? Because he has the reputation, let's say, of having been the most powerful opponent to a policy of enlargement in the European Union. France, under his presidency, has been strongly responsible for holding up enlargement to the Western Balkans, stopping the opening of negotiations with Macedonia and Albania for a long time. So it is crucial, that say this important member state changes positions in order for enlargement to move forward. And we've seen quite a change in position in the recent months and weeks, and I just list a few quotes here. The main one for me is that for him the question is not whether we should enlarge. We answered that question a year ago, nor when we should enlarge. For me, as swiftly as possible. That's quite a new tone, but rather how we should do it. And then he goes on to list two possible mistakes in this process. One is mentions to give hope to the Western Balkans, Ukraine and Moldova, and then procrastinate. And he's quite honest. We are very familiar with this tactic because this is what we've done in the past decade. Quite an accurate description of what the EU has done. On the other hand, he also says, well, the other mistake would be if we just went ahead with enlargement without internal reform. So he said this would also be disastrous. Now, obviously, these are two possible mistakes, but there's also, let's say, some kind of tension in trying to avoid these mistakes. If you're really serious about introducing political reforms ahead of enlargement, then it will not be swift. It will not. Then that would be a recipe for procrastination, given the difficulties of introducing these reforms. Okay, so focusing on the how question, let me talk a little bit about, let's say, the conditions of a successful enlargement process. So in the EU, in the main method of enlargement has, as I already alluded to it at the beginning, has been accession conditionality, where it's basically some kind of bargain. The EU offers membership with all the benefits that come with it, under the condition that the candidates meet certain conditions. And then whether this moves forward or not depends on the credibility of this conditionality. And that has basically two parts: the credibility of the EU's promise, that is, candidate countries need to be certain that when they meet the conditions, they will also get the reward, full membership, and the credibility of the threat, which means you cannot hope to achieve membership if you don't meet the conditions. Now, the problem with enlargement before 2022 was that the credibility of the promise has basically been lost as a result of a number of factors. Enlargement fatigue in public opinion. Several EU member states have introduced the threat of holding a referendum after the next accession treaty. France was one of them, which basically means, okay, you meet all the conditions, the EU makes a decision to enlarge, and this can always fail in a referendum. And the Dutch referendum on the association treaty with Ukraine in 2016, I think it was, has already shown that this can actually ruin any deals done at the intergovernmental level. There has been a huge discussion in the EU on the so-called absorption capacity, which is another way of saying the boat is full, and we cannot have additional member states. At the same time, the EU has, in its changes of the enlargement strategy, made accession conditionality increasingly rigid, so making it harder for the candidate states to meet the conditions at a time when the EU was faced with candidates that actually had, say, much more difficult legacies, domestic situations, economic situations than the previous member states, which basically meant, okay, these are conditions you cannot really fulfill in a foreseeable future. And then this process was also undermined by a number of illegitimate conditions from this democratic conditionality perspective, like the famous name dispute between North Macedonia and Greece. And that has not only slowed down the enlargement process as such, it has also facilitated it for authoritarian leaders in the candidate countries to say, look, the EU is not serious about its enlargement prospects anyway, so we don't need to be serious about our democratic reforms. And that has actually played into the hands of people like Vučić in Serbia or Erdogan in Turkey. Now, with the change to geopolitical enlargement, what we actually see is also a change in this credibility dilemma. On the one hand, the war on Ukraine and the shift to a more geopolitical enlargement has improved the credibility of the promise of membership. We've seen a wave of public solidarity across the European Union in favor of support for EU assistance in many ways. We've already seen high investments of the European Union in, for instance, the defense of Ukraine, but also in terms of supporting public finances and so on. These bilateral conflicts have been mainly sidelined. The EU has started now accession negotiations with North Macedonia that were held up by Bulgaria before. And we've also seen, and that was the Macron example, a strong public commitment of EU institutional leaders, so von der Leyen, makes that a very strong point of her Commission leadership, for instance, and even traditionally enlargement skeptical national leaders. The problem for the credibility of the promise remains in two ways that Macron also alluded to. One is the sustainability of public support. Yeah? Will that last over time? Will that last when also the costs of enlargement become more visible? We've already seen that recently in the case of Poland and other neighboring countries of the European Union, where at some point they realized, okay, that Ukraine actually is an agricultural powerhouse, and that this will crowd out our farmers, showing where also the limits of solidarity are. And then there's this linkage to EU institutional reform, which I think is the trickiest issue, because these institutional reforms, and mostly people talk about abolishing unanimity in favor of qualified majority voting, these institutional reforms need unanimity themselves. And I think the big question in that respect is, EU leaders have talked about these reforms for a long time. There has been no consensus on these reforms. And for enlargement to change this, you would need to assume that for those EU governments that were against abolishing unanimity, for instance, in foreign policy, enlargement is a higher priority than keeping their veto rights. And I can easily picture a number of governments, the Hungarian, for instance, where this is definitely not the case. So that might weaken the credibility of the promise over time, but also in a reversal of the earlier situation, this geopolitical context might also weaken the credibility of the threat of the European Union not to integrate countries that do not fulfill its democratic, etc. conditions. This time pressure might be one fact, but the most important fact is actually the geopolitical competition. I mean, could the EU afford to give up or lose a future Ukraine that, develops into a non-democratic direction, that does not keep its promises on the reform of the judiciary and so on. And this can, of course, be exploited by authoritarian governments. And we already see that. Just last week, I was in a meeting in Brussels, which also included a representative of the Georgian government, which was not granted candidate status for political reasons. And that is the government that tried to introduce a Russian-style foreign agent law earlier this year. And this representative basically said, look, we've been the first victim of Russian aggression in 2007, so we deserve to be included in this enlargement policy too. And if you don't do it, you drive us in the arms of the Russians. Yeah. So basically, to avoid any political reforms, this is the kind of geopolitical discussion that you face. Now, what is the solution for navigating the dilemma? I think the solution is some kind of differentiated integration in the EU. That's something that the EU has always done with new member states. And it can mean either legal EU membership without full participation in EU policies, or it can mean some kind of external differentiation where non-member states selectively participate in EU policies without legal membership. And we've seen that in the context of preparatory association agreements, as well as post-accession transitional arrangements with the EU. And we've also seen basically a clear correlation. The poorer new member states are, the more numerous and the more durable these internal differentiations are, and they refer to exclusions from expenditure policies, agriculture, cohesion, but also exclusion from policies where there's a high demand on state capacity, for instance, in the monetary union and Schengen. And what you can see here is basically the mean number of differentiations that new member states have had when they joined the European Union. The solid line is the overall average. Below you see an enlargement round with rich new member states, so it's definitely lower. They also approximate zero much faster, and the upper line is the most recent new member states: Bulgaria, Croatia, Romania, which are, say, on the poor end of the membership, and quite clearly they not only started with a higher number of differentiations, but it also takes them much longer to bring these down. And I think this will be the likely outcome of any future enlargement as well. Will probably, if it's going to work, it will probably even exceed what we've seen in the case of Bulgaria, Romania, and Croatia. I also think that this kind of differentiated integration is more likely to happen than internal reform. And the reason is quite simply that it is easier for the current member states to find an agreement on the exclusion of future member states than it is, let's say, to reform their own powers within the European Union. So to take the example that I brought before, it's easier to say, for instance, that new member states cannot have any veto rights than saying, okay, we will give up our own veto rights. And I think given the strong demand of future new member states like Ukraine and Moldova to actually join the European Union, they will be quite ready to accept any kind of such discrimination for the moment, under the condition that this will be for a limited time and they will have the chance to change it. So my conclusion, so this is supposed to be a policy talk, so I end with a recommendation. What I would think would be the best way forward for the European Union is indeed to offer fast legal membership to the candidate countries, say under some minimal conditions for democracy and the rule of law, because that is, in my view, the best way to respond to the changed geopolitical context, to send a strong signal of durable commitment to these countries. It also makes the best use of the current wave of public support that is unlikely to last. And it would also make sure that any future investment that the EU makes and will have to make in these countries will actually be an investment in the European Union. And it will also prevent procrastination. But that needs to find support among the membership, that needs to be combined with highly reinforced internal differentiation, long open-ended transition periods to alleviate member states' concerns, an exclusion, a temporary exclusion, not only from sensitive policies, but probably also veto rights in the EU, combined with what we already have now, financial sanctions for democratic backsliding. That would alleviate the need actually for immediate institutional or policy reforms, for which I see the chances as being quite slim. And it would also be preferable to a long period of external differentiation for these candidates. I think for the candidates, it's more important to gain that status of a member rather than just getting more money. And as I said, it would also better fit with the geopolitical exigencies of our time. And once these countries become members, I think it would also create additional pressure for reform, both for the European Union and for these countries, that will be more effective than when you leave them outside. Okay, thank you. I went a bit out on a limb here, and I'm looking forward to your comments.